series of breakfast talks were set up to be in person, a chance to meet gentlemen like Joe, who works in city or county government, in a format that, we're here to help each other do our jobs. So I'm Brian McMorrow. I'm with V3 Companies, civil engineers, surveyors, landscape architects with an office here in South Bend. I'm currently serving as president of the Home Builders Association of St. Joe Valley. Bob Penrose is our executive officer and has been our AV expert through all the year on Zoom. We are going to record this for those that were unable to be here in person, and also for all of you, so don't feel necessary to take notes or anything like that. But I think you're in for a treat. This is kind of a different little talk. I started following Joe's podcasts and blogs on the research he did regarding the population and household decline in South Bend, going way back into you'll hear the details, but how it happened, why it happened, and I think understanding how and why is going to make us make better informed decisions about planning for the city and the county moving forward. So I won't say anything more. Joe is a planner with the City of South Bend Planning Department. Do you want to say anything else about yourself before you jump in? Or?
I'm not a planner.
Okay.
And I'm a zoning specialist.
Zoning specialist.
I pride myself in not being a planner. Don't tell my boss that. But.
All right, well, you can take it away.
Yeah, so thanks, Brian. Like Brian said, I work for the city. Official titles is zoning specialist. I think I've worked with a couple of you, and we've been on a couple of Zoom calls before the last couple of years. This side project of mine kind of started in the pandemic lull, right? We all found ourselves with a lot of weekends where we didn't have a lot to do. No events, no things, and I took to walking around South Bend in my time. So I have two little kids in the city, and in April of 2020 there was not much to do. You couldn't even take them to parks at the time, if you remember. So all we could really do was walk around. And when walking around, I would see. So this all came out of an article series I wrote, like Brian said. The whole series is on West SV, which is a great blog that does a lot of stories about the city and about the people in the city. You can find the whole podcast and the whole series there. But the reason it started was because I was walking around my neighborhood, and I would walk around the city of South Bend, and I would find things like this that I kind of termed ghost architecture. So where you find remnants of a house or remnants of a time that's long gone, but it clearly existed, right? So you have a staircase to nothing, but there was once a house here. Clearly, like why else would we put a staircase there? There's clearly still a neighborhood, as you can see. There's a house here, there's actually a house right over here, but there's 4 vacant lots on this road. And I'd walk this neighborhood, and I'd walk the city, and I'd go, why are these lots vacant? I had a little assumption, but it really kind of hit me when you start walking neighborhoods, how much vacant land is in South Bend, specifically residential land. Why did that happen? Well, I would ask people, and I would talk to people, and I get like the normal story that I'm sure most of you who are familiar with St. Joe County know. We used to have Studebaker, right? So this is Studebaker at its height. This is Studebaker 84 and the administration building. These are the only 2 buildings left of this complex. We are probably right here. Yeah, we're like probably right in this general area. The sample runs right here. Okay. So the whole idea was, right, we had Studebaker, we had manufacturing, we had jobs. That's what's always the narrative, right? We had all these jobs. Those jobs and that money and that wealth helped build this. This is downtown South Bend in the 20s. The county city building today is right here. This was a great downtown, a great urban space. South Bend from 1920 to 1924 built more buildings than any other city in the whole country. South Bend was booming in the 1920s. And I helped build this. This is the NNN back in 1939. Just extreme levels of density. These are all single-family homes, so not quite the row houses and apartment blocks that you'd see more on the East Coast, but still extremely dense. This census tract had a density of over 15,000 people per square mile. which is more dense than all the boroughs in New York today except for Manhattan. So extremely dense city that we had at one time. But then the story, as you go and you talk about what happened to South Bend, the story is, well, this is what happened to Studebaker and most of our other factories, right? Studebaker closed, Oliver closed, Bendix shrank, Singer closed, that's the story. The manufacturing jobs left, which then, here's Singer today, which then led to this. We also tried this urban renewal thing because we were so afraid we were losing our manufacturing jobs, so we foolishly tore down our whole downtown essentially to try something new. And then this is what happened to our neighborhoods. So this is the same shot I showed you before, but in 2019. Obviously the internet has actually helped out somewhat better than other neighborhoods, but as you can see, pockmarked with vacant lots. Obviously this does not have the density of anything close to any borough in New York today. And this chart kind of sums that whole story up, right? So this is the population history of the city of South Bend, starting back in 1840, the first time South Bend pops up on the census. You peak in 1960, and conveniently for the story, especially for the myth we tell ourselves about Studebaker, Studebaker closes, or at least its South Bend factory closes in 1963, and conveniently, it's all downhill since then to 2010, which is the most recent data we have. Hopefully we'll get 2020 in like a month. We're supposed to get it a while ago. So that's the story, right? I'm sure most of you are familiar with that general story. South Bend used to be a manufacturing hub. South Bend used to have a lot of money. South Bend used to be a place with a lot of jobs. Those jobs have gone, either just don't exist at all anymore, or they moved overseas, or they moved to the south. That's the story. So forth, we lost our population. Everything kind of trickles down from there. But when you think about it for more than like the 5-minute cursory thought of South Bend, you start to pick holes in that myth, right? So this is St. Joe County's population history. It's a different chart, right? Right now, even though the growth slowed in 1960, which makes sense because our booming industries stopped booming, it only lost population one time. And today has more people than any time before. There's more people living in St. Joe County today than at the height of Studebaker, at the height of Bendix, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting because St. Joe County, as all of you I'm sure will know, it's kind of one labor market, right? People live in South Bend and work in Mishawaka. People live in Granger and work in South Bend. If it was all the factories, that's why we lost people, which should have happened to St. Joe County too, right? And then if you pull out the data even more, because what I showed you before, that was the whole county. If you pull out the city limits and then the rest of St. Joe County, that's the two different charts, right? So starting in 1920, the county, or at least the unincorporated county in Mishawaka, have seen near straight growth. There hasn't been it's a straight line. Even the crash of 2008 doesn't really even show up here, right? Now, compared again to South Bend. Again, St. Joe County as a whole has lost 70% of its manufacturing jobs since the 1960s. Mishawaka has lost 65% of its manufacturing jobs since the 1960s. So why didn't that collapse in manufacturing lead to a collapse in population for the whole county? And this is different than other Rust Belt communities in the Midwest where their whole counties have depopulated. You see a very similar story to South Bend, but in say Akron and in say Gary or Flint, the whole counties have been losing population. We have not seen that here, especially if you look at the suburbs in Mishawaka, it's a straight line. So clearly there's more to the dynamic at play than just, we lost jobs. Because if the whole county is losing these jobs, it should have affected the county as a whole, right? So if not the factories, if there's more at play than just, there was job loss, what was it? Well, because like I said, St. Joe County has more people residing in its boundaries today than any time before. The county managed this increase in the same economy, job market, and weather conditions to South Bend. These are some of the big ones if you talk, especially if on Facebook, or if you get together and look at it and say, why did South Bend lose people? The economy's bad, there's no jobs here, everyone moved to the south, the weather sucks, it snows. It snows just as much as in Mishawaka as it does in South Bend. It snows just as much in Clay Township as it does in South Bend. So there are obviously bigger forces at play. And there are forces larger than the loss of factory jobs if you're talking about South Bend's falling population. And what I've kind of come up, the theory I'm kind of presenting, it was kind of a perfect snowball, a series of unfortunate events that There were little things that happened in the 1920s through the 1960s that once they started going downhill, once the good times end, that snowball became a thing that South Bend couldn't avoid. We're going to talk about these things today. The biggest one I think that most people don't think of is declining household size and also the fight that South Bend had in the suburbs. So first I do want to talk about, so the title of this series is How South Bend Lost 50,000 People in 50 Years. But if you say, hey Joe, we had 132,000 people at our height, we have 102,000 now, that's 30,000, where do you get the extra 20 or so? Well, as you know, South Bend has grown its municipal boundaries since 1960. So this image here in the middle, that was the entire built environment of the city of South Bend in 1960. This is a fire code map that they mapped the entire city for insurance purposes. So 132,000 people would fit essentially right there. I think there's some missing up on near Ironwood, but this is basically the geographic footprint of South Bend in 1960. 132,000 people, right? Really dense. Now, South Bend encompasses everything in blue. So the airport's here, the target on the south side is right here. In that whole big blue boundary, we only have 102,000. So we've grown, we've almost doubled our geographic size, but we haven't made up for the fact that if you just look at the 1960 city limits, that actual population has grown to 86,000. So nearly 50,000 people have left this floor in 50 years. And this is widespread across the historic city. When I say historic, we're talking 1960 and prior. And it's not just the west side. I think a lot of people, especially me, when I started this, thought like, oh, it must be the west side. I drive on the west side, there's a lot of vacant factories, there's no land, there's a lot of vacant fields. But it's not just the west side. Decline happened across every single census tract of 1960 South Bend. Everywhere in red, lost people. Again, so targets like right here, here's the airport. So the entire core of the city has lost people. And coincidentally enough, some of the west side tracts have done better than some of the east side tracts. The area around Notre Dame has lost 31% of its peak population. River Park has lost 21%. And some neighborhoods on the west side have lost 60 to 70% of their population. So I wanted to say that too. We're not just talking about a couple of neighborhoods on the west side. We're talking about the entire city. Well, how did that happen? Because if you walk around River Park today, or if you walk around Sunnyview today, there's not really any vacant lots, right? And that comes down to, how did the first decline happen? Well, household size. So this is an image today of River Park, just north of Mishawaka Avenue. As you can see here, there's probably a couple of lots, like a parking lot here for this church that used to have houses, but generally the urban fabric has remained nearly the exact way it was in the 1920s. Here is near St. Albert's on the west side. Obviously, the neighborhood's actually held up pretty well, but everywhere I put a star, there's at least one vacant lot. Clearly, this neighborhood has seen declining housing units. There's less housing units on this image than there was in 1960. Some of these large squares where there used to, or large squares, used to be 4 or 5 houses. You would think, just common sense, right, that River Park has done better than the neighbor on the west side. It's done better than St. Albans. Right? You would just think, because the houses are still there. But actually, River Park's lost more people. So River Park has lost 21% of its 1960 population. St. Albert's has lost 19%, even though it has way less housing units than it did in 1960. Well, how can that happen? Well, because in each one of these houses, on both neighborhoods, there's a lot less people than there used to be. We have a lot less kids than we used to do. I guarantee most of you, your parents had more brothers and sisters than you do. Not always, but on average. My mom was one of 15. My dad was one of 9. I'm one of 3, and I have 2 kids, and we're stopping at 2. That is, so one generation, you can see the fall, right? So the reason this neighborhood has kept its population up more, even though it's lost housing units, is this has become a center of Hispanic immigration in South Bend. This is one of the neighborhoods where if you're a Hispanic immigrant into South Bend, or you're a part of the Hispanic community, you usually land in this neighborhood first. Like all immigrants throughout the entire history of the United States, immigrants have larger family sizes than the base native population. That has been true going back to 1790. Immigrant families always have large, and as they assimilate into the culture of the United States, their family sizes shrink through generations. But in this neighborhood has a slightly higher household size than the average. There's like still 3 to 4 people living in each house. Well, over here you have 2 to 3. So that's why this neighborhood is actually held on. But that shows you that even though a neighborhood has completely stayed the same, right? River Park has some issues, but it's a very stable neighborhood. It has a stable housing market. You can sell your house, you can buy a house. It's lost almost a quarter of its population. And that's happened in the city as a whole. So in 1960, we had 3.2 people per household. That has dropped to 2.54 in 2010. And this tracks the United States as a whole. South Bend is not unique at all in this. These numbers are almost exactly the United States average for 1960 and 2010. I think actually we're a tiny bit higher on both. So this is not something that, oh, is what happened in South Bend. This has just happened, as I said, each generation has had less kids, less people in household. This number is finally flatlined, which we'll talk about in a second. But that alone counts for way more of the population decline than you would think, even if we lost no housing units in that case. So from 1960 to 1990, we lost 25,000 people. But if just the households had stayed the same, if every generation had the same amount of kids as their parents' generation, we would have actually gained 6,000 residents. Because we actually didn't lose housing units from 1960 to 1990. We all think the 60s and 70s and 80s were a terrible time in South Bend. All the factories are closing. Well, we'll show you in a second. If this goes. We actually were still growing in households. So this is a big graph we'll break down here. So you have the year for each census on the left, you have the population of the city. Then you have critically, which no one really thinks about this, you have the households. So a housing unit, which is what you guys deal with, right? You don't build a house for one person, you build a house for either a couple or one person moving in or the whole family. We don't think in terms of population when we're building houses, we think of housing units, which make up households. And then you have population divided by households, and you have your growth in households. So as you see, in 1960, we did see a dramatic change, but we still were growing. Actually, the best decade in the past 5 decades was the 70s, where we gained 800 households. But it wasn't enough to make up for the fact that the population per household was shrinking. The city wasn't building enough housing to make up for the fact that each house had less people. But in 2000, we had more households than in 1960, which I don't think anyone would think of normally, right? You would never think, oh, in 2000, this city has more households than it did at the highest, when Studebaker was around. Part of that is because we've annexed, we've grown on the edges. Some neighborhoods don't have the same amount of households. But we'll get to what happened in the 2000s, which I think all you in the Home Builders Association know what happened in the late 2000s. But I wanted to point this out that we kept growing even through those supposedly terrible times. If the household number would have just stayed the same, the city would have never lost people. But why did that not? South Bend has been shrinking in household size for its entire history, like the country has. When South Bend was first coming around in 1860, we had a household size of near 6, and then it was down to 3.2 by the 1960s. So we were able to accommodate that collapse with growing households. Why didn't that happen? And the county has, right? The overall population of the county has grown. Well, that's where you talk about urbanization. So from 1970 to 1990, like I pointed out, we were still growing in households, but it wasn't enough to make up for the fact that each house just has less people. As kids moved away and a new family came into a house, they only had 2 kids instead of the 4 kids that left, and so forth. But why did this happen? Was this just Studebaker, or was there something else here? Because again, the whole county had that collapse in manufacturing this time. But why did this drop? Because if I put the county in here, these numbers, the 60s and 70s will look really similar. What happened? Well, you have to think about how did our built environment change, and what were the larger forces as a nation as a whole impacting South Bend. So this was an ad from the federal government in the early 1950s. The federal government wanted you to move to the suburbs. They did everything you could because the bureaucrats in Washington and the Congress people in Washington thought living in the suburbs was what will help protect the city. Remember the Cold War is going on, we were really afraid of nuclear bombs hitting cities, so we thought, oh, let's spread out the population. We thought people living in suburbs was good as opposed to tenements. That's not actually a bad idea with that. I do think it's funny that obviously this is pretty old because they're still using the train as to get to the suburbs as opposed to a car. But the federal government put in place a lot of policies to incentivize people to move to the suburbs and to incentivize the builders to build in the suburbs, right? When the vets came home from World War II, they were given loans to buy houses, but only in the suburbs. So if you go back and look at the programs that were put in place for veteran loans, you could not use those veteran loans to buy a house that was existing. It had to be a brand new house on a greenfield site. Also, of course, was only for white people. African American soldiers who fought in World War II weren't available to GI Bill didn't apply to them. But in the 1950s, so immediately post World War II, the suburbs were still inside South Bend. So this is Edison Park. This was a suburb. This was the very edge of town. If you look at the 1950s aerial of South Bend, there's cornfields after Edison, right? This was the very edge of town. But as you can see, it's still a city neighborhood, right? It still has a grid pattern for the most part. It still has sidewalks. Edison School is right here, so it's surrounding a public asset. There's a big park there as well. And crucially enough, the city was able to grow its municipal boundaries at this point, where the suburbs were still inside South Bend. When you start getting into the 60s, in Clay Township, which is seeing rapid growth at this time, you're no longer in the city limits, right? And you can see that in the way that the streets are laid out, long blocks, no sidewalks, big frontage, you know what we think. And by the time you get to the 1980s and further, you get out of Granger, that's where the major growth of the city is. This is a very typical Granger house. So when you guys want to build this? So, but why weren't these new suburbs in South Bend? If you know anything about Fort Wayne, Indiana, Fort Wayne, Allen County has seen a lot of growth too. But Fort Wayne just keeps growing its municipal boundaries outwards. We think of Fort Wayne as like twice the size of South Bend, but Allen County actually isn't that much bigger than St. Joe County. It's just Fort Wayne doesn't have a Mishawaka, and it also doesn't have a Granger. It's just all Fort Wayne, right? So why did that happen in South Bend? Well, because the suburbs, while the war stayed out, and I don't use war lightly, especially just after talking about World War II, because this was a very, 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 very hot topic in the 1950s through the 1980s in St. Joe County. Whole organizations sprang up to fight the city of South Bend from annexing them. The city tried repeatedly to annex its suburbs, right? So this was a map that Joe Kernan put out in the late 1990s. This was actually the last big gasp of the city to try to annex. So as you can see, all of Clay Township, a lot of German Township, a lot of stuff on the south side, Notre Dame. The city tried to annex its suburbs, and if you also think, that's what the city had been doing for its entire history. When I showed that population graph, when we started in 1940, how do you think South Bend got to its shape by 1940? It annexed farmland. As population grew in St. Joe County, it was like, okay, South Bend, time to annex another half a square mile, put some roads in, build some houses, and keep going, keep going, keep going, expand the grid, right? That whole system broke down in the 1960s. And it was this attitude for why? As residents, this is from, so someone wrote this into the Tribune in December 6, 1992. This is the last big fight. As residents of Clay Township, we have said before, we don't want the city, we don't need the city. Clay Township residents will fight in the battle. We will not be annexed by South Bend. And that attitude, you can go and find about 5,000 of these. If you look from if you Google annexation, or if you search in newspapers.com, annexation 1960, 1990 in the South Bend Tribune, you get about 5,000 of these. And we're going to talk about we don't need the city, because it's going to come up a little bit. And whole groups formed to fight South Bend from annexing them. This group called Hoosier Suburbia, that was based actually in Center Township and had a branch in Clay Township, formed in the 1950s, and it was basically a lobbying group that went down to the State House and pressured lawmakers to pass laws to make it for all cities. It eventually became a statewide organization that was founded in St. Joe County that made it difficult for cities to grow. They didn't want cities to annex their land. And the city lost. We all know that, right? So, it's funny enough, Mishawaka got caught up in this as well. Mishawaka doesn't annex much more either. So the city lost. If you go in the early 1990s, there was this big battle about this. Eventually, a state law was passed in the early 1990s that only impacted St. Joe County. That said, cities in St. Joe County, so Mishawaka again was pulled into this. Cities in St. Joe County have to go through like 18 layers of bureaucratic identities in order to annex land. Even if a majority of residents want to be annexed, not good enough. Even if 3/4 of residents wanted to be annexed, not good enough. They had to be like 99% landowners, and it had to be a geographic area that had like more than 5,000 residents already. Basically made it impossible, unless it was voluntary farmland from one of you developers who wanted to annex it right away. So the city abandoned it. The city abandoned large-scale annexation in the early 1990s. The city actually fought multiple court cases, which we lost them all. Suburbs usually have a lot of money to fight these court cases. And the city even tried to annex Notre Dame in the early 1970s, which this one always interests me. So I didn't really know about this, but Lloyd Allen, the last Republican mayor of the city of South Bend, he was a really big proponent in the fact that South Bend and St. Joe County have to work together. And he thought one of the biggest things hurting the city in this relationship was that becoming our biggest industry was not in the cities, right? They're their own entity. You guys all know Notre Dame's its own little entity. But he said, can we at least annex you? We'll sign an agreement. You can keep your fire department, you can keep all your things that make you special. We just want to be able to include your residential population into our count so we can receive more federal dollars. It won't affect you at all. Father Hesper didn't like that. They fought it. It failed in the council like 8-1 in the 1970s. And this was the consequence, right? So South Bend lost. The note, clearly part of the South Bend region, right? We're all St. Joe County. Again, it's all one conglomerate. Look at a map. This is 1987. This is today in Granger. Huge growth, right? So when you say St. Joe County's not growing, oh, okay, 1980s today, huge growth, huge growth, but outside of the city limits. And what's interesting about this is nearly half of all residents in Granger work in South Bend. So that's where we're going to talk about jobs in a second. It's all about jobs. Well, why did Granger grow? There's no jobs in Granger. Well, there's like, kind of high school, but that's about it. South Bend lost, and people who work in South Bend go elsewhere when they go home at night. And suburbanization left South Bend vulnerable, right? So even though South Bend was still a central city, the city had failed to annex its suburbs, so it was left as kind of a hollowed out core. That left South Bend really vulnerable for the worst decade in South Bend history. And whenever I say that this is the worst decade in South Bend history, people say, no, that was the 60s. That was when Studebaker closed. That's when all these things were happening. Well, if you look at it from a population standpoint, oh, no. The 2000s were terrible. In the first time in South Bend's entire history, going all the way back to 1840, we lost households. Not just people, households. And it wasn't like 50. We lost 3,000 households in one decade. And funny enough, our population per household actually got a little bigger, but it didn't make up nearly for the fact that we lost 3,000 households. And actually, we now have less households than we did in 1960. So all that growth, that slow growth that we got in the second half of the 20th century, we lost in one decade. Well, so how did this is a neighborhood on the west side, and this is in 1999. So this is 30 years after Studebaker closed, and this neighborhood has, more or less survived, right? If you look at aerial photos from like 1990 to 1999, 2000, the neighborhoods had stabilized. They weren't really declining anymore. We actually saw growth in the 1990s. So for the first time since 1960, we actually saw growth from 1990 to 2000 in population. If you were telling this story in 2001, you would say like, well, the worst is probably behind us, right? Our household is stabilized. We're growing a little bit every year. It's going to be okay. And our neighborhoods had stabilized. But then how did this, so 1999, become this in 20 years? That's wild. This is Detroit level societal collapse of the community, right? So we're gonna do that again. So look at a block, this block, and remember, like, people live here. This is someone's home.
What year is that? Where is this?
This is on the near west side near City Cemetery, just west of City Cemetery. This is 1999. This isn't the 60s. This is all of our lifetimes. 1999 to today. So, I don't need to tell you guys about the 2000 housing bubble. I'm sure you all had more painful experiences with it than I did. Very, sum it up, low interest rates, lots of adjustable rate mortgages, lots of speculation in the housing market, big housing bubble, it popped, right? You guys could teach me about it the other way around. Housing prices cratered, people owe more on their house than what they're worth, foreclosures skyrocketed, 15% of all households in South Bend experience foreclosures. 15, some neighborhoods over 75% of households experience foreclosure.
Those are completed foreclosures?
Completed foreclosures. And from 2000 to 2010. So, but why did that hit South Bend so hard, right? Why? This was a national phenomenon, right? Like, every house basically in the country from like 2004 to 2008 lost 50% of its value. Some areas held on a lot better than others, certainly, and some areas held on worse, but that was the average loss, or close to the average loss out of the whole country. Well, it was where we started. Remember, South Bend was left really vulnerable, and the average South Bend house in 2008, 2007 was about 40 to 50,000, especially in a lot of our working class, inner neighborhoods. It was about 40 to 50 grand. Well, if every house, like if the whole housing market, basically everywhere, dropped. You guys all know it all dropped. If you took a $300,000 house and you lose half of it, you're still left with a $150,000 house. It still makes a lot of sense for you to put a roof on that house. It still makes a lot of sense for a bank to give you a loan to a house that's worth 150 grand. It still has innate value. You guys all know about this. But if you get to this level, where you actually want to lose 20 grand, I mean, this is really bad. Don't get me wrong, this is really bad for someone who owns this house. You just lost half your equity. Like, that sucks. And you have to wait 10, 15, 20 years to get it back. But if it happens when you're here, at 20 grand and lower, the bank won't give you a loan, or the bank won't give anyone a loan to buy your house, right? Even lower, even higher than now. It doesn't make any sense for you to put an $8,000 roof on a $20,000 house, right? No sane person owns a $20,000 house, unless it's just out of care of their heart and they love the house. No one's gonna make a $10,000 investment. No one's gonna put a new water heater in a house that's worth 20 grand, because you're not gonna get your money back, right? This is so people foreclosed. People just walked away. Or they lost their job, right? Great Recession, they couldn't pay. These are the foreclosure map from 2001 to 2007. Again, the whole central city was hit. Yes, the west side was hit the hardest. Southeast side, River Park, we just showed that map. River Park, pretty stable neighborhood. Lots of foreclosures. Northeast as well. Bad time in the city. And vacant, and this led, all remember the vacant housing debate. This led to vacant houses double. When you have foreclosures, especially when you had LLCs from California, from Israel, God, I can't tell you how many of our empty lots are owned by people in Tel Aviv for some reason. When you have these absentee landlords who were just milking the property for as much as they could get, and then eventually the house deteriorated to the point it wasn't worth anything and they just walked away, and our tax system isn't set up to go after them and say you need to pay your taxes, you saw vacant houses double. So from 1960, South Bend had 1,600 vacant houses. To 2000, that number had increased to 3,400. Not good. But if you see the increase, in the 90s again, it had actually gone down. You were starting to stabilize. It started to make sense. In one decade, we doubled. We went from 3,400 to 6,500 in a single decade. And really, it's probably about 4 or 5 years that happened. So you're talking 600, 700, 800 houses being abandoned every year. And again, this is the cost. This is 1990. All these pictures are 1999 to 2019. Neighborhood after neighborhood, especially.
What neighborhood is that?
What
neighborhood is that?
This is, I believe, the southeast side. So this is near Riley High School. If you ever want to know what you're doing. This is right next to City Cemetery. So City Cemetery is right here. 1999, full block. Kids lived here. People lived here. People still live here. A lot less. Just, 20 years. Our lifetimes, this was happening. And a lot of this is a consequence of the vacant houses, right? The city, and we can go around and around, if 1,000 houses in 1,000 days was good. But these visual images are possible because we tore down about 700 of those vacant homes. Because they were vacant, they were abandoned, a lot of them were burnt out. If you don't remember, I remember in the late 2000s, I watched the news with my parents, or I'd turn on WNDU at 10 o'clock. Almost every night it seemed there was a house fire. This is the city of South Bend, right? House fires were just like, one a week, because they were all vacant. We don't really see that as much anymore, because a lot of those vacant houses are now just fields. And one thing that's really kind of important to say too about this is these neighborhoods. This is actually, this one is the southeast as well. These neighborhoods were all built in like the 1910s, 1920s. These houses are now 100 years old. And as you all know, a 100-year-old house needs a lot of work, even just to keep it sustainable. If there's no value in that house, you're going to keep seeing decline. And this is the internet at large. So again, 1999. So I showed you that image from the 30s when the internet was extremely dense. It had lost some of that density by the 90s, but again, all the population decline at this point was largely just the fact that there were less people in each house. Not the case anymore, there's just less houses. So, the housing crash happened. And that's kind of where we are today, right? We've got a little more of the story to go, but that's essentially how that happened. But I do want to talk about still some of the myths, or not myths, but some of the parts that are only a part of the fact. So closing factors hurt, right? I will not tell you that, losing 7, 8, 9,000 manufacturing jobs was good for St. Joe County, was good for South Bend. But if you want to look at just population, if you want to look at why South Bend lost people and Mishawaka didn't, if you want to look at why South Bend lost people and Granger didn't, or St. Joe County didn't as a whole, you have to look more deeply than jobs, because again, it's all kind of one housing market, and even at that, South Bend is still the jobs leader of St. Joe County. So these are the nearest numbers I could get, but so the number of jobs, this all comes from the census, everything in here has come from the census. In 2018, South Bend had 53% of all jobs in St. Joe County. So over half of all jobs in St. Joe County, and that doesn't count Notre Dame. So if you wanted to throw Notre Dame in as like near adjacent, close to 60%. But it only has 38% of the population. At a metro level, it's even bigger, so again, about half, a little less than half, but less than a third. So if it was just jobs, right? If, everyone says, what can South Bend do? Well, how about we get a giant factory? What if we got Toyota to come? So say Toyota came and they went out near the airport. And that'd be great for the community as a whole, right? That'd be great for St. Joe County if Toyota or Honda or GM built a plant here again, right? And they employed, even though those factories don't employ that many people anymore, and they employed 2,000, 3,000 people. I don't know if that would actually help South Bend's population. Most of those people don't end up living in the city, right? Because we already have the majority of the jobs. And it's because 72% of people who work in South Bend don't live here. So that's how you get the game. If you just add a bunch of jobs, again, good for the overall metro economy, but if you specifically want to help South Bend's population, you have to find a way to get the people who have those jobs to want to live in South Bend and to buy a house in South Bend. Because right now, 3 out of 4 people who work in South Bend don't live here. And you can see this at our night and daytime population. So this is basically our resident population. And this was pre-COVID, so who knows now. But daytime population in 2018, 20,000 extra people come into the city every day to work, to play, to go to Morris, Park, whatever. The census estimates 20,000 people. And this counts the people in South Bend who leave to go to Elkhart to work, or leave to go to Mishawaka. It's a net gain of 20,000 people. So South Bend is still clearly the hub of St. Joe County. And again, that doesn't count Notre Dame. And so when I gave this presentation, a lot of people were like, yeah, Joe, but they're all like bad jobs, right? South Bend is all bad jobs. Well, not if you look at the numbers. The census breaks up jobs into 3 categories: bottom, middle, and top. There's weird, they do it like by hourly rate, it's really weird. But essentially, in worst paying jobs, okay paying jobs, good paying jobs. 41% of jobs in South Bend are in the highest bracket, compared to 31% in Mishawaka. Mishawaka has grown by 20,000 people since the 1960s. But it's not because they have a ton of good paying jobs. Maybe there's good paying jobs in Mishawaka, but it's not because of the difference between the two. South Bend jobs, on average, are better paying than the overall job market in St. Joe County. You would never know this talking to anybody. I wouldn't have known this. I would have said, yeah, jobs in Mishawaka pay better. They don't. It's got to be more than jobs. You can't just talk about jobs when you talk about population. But why should we care, right? Like, it's all St. Joe County. Yeah, some neighborhoods are basically bombed out war zones, but like, why should we care? Well, it has negative consequences on everybody, on us in this room, and of course on the people who live in some of these neighborhoods. Because for one, wealth generated in South Bend doesn't stay here, right? So if South Bend has a lot of jobs, and all those people making money, they don't spend the money and it doesn't get regurgitated. From a city perspective, so not really your guys' problem, but from my perspective and from the mayor and every, if people are trying to make the streets get paved, that's not good. South Bend is poorer than all surrounding communities. by a ton. Even though, again, you think, okay, the city with the best paying job should have the highest median income. Well, it's the exact opposite. And South Bend schools are worse because of it. South Bend streets are worse because of it. Crime worse because of it. Parks worse because of it. I heard you guys talking about the Potawatomi disaster. So what are some of the costs? Why should we care about population decline? Well, these headlines were pulled from the last 3 years. South Bend schools are shrinking. All right, that's when you have less people, you have less children. Not only the fact that, again, we built a school system for 1960 when everybody had 4 kids. Now those same amount of households, but only 2 kids. For one, that alone is going to screw your school system over. And then if you just lose people on top of it, you built a school system for 30,000 kids and you only got 16,000. You know, and there's a lot of other stuff that plays into schools, like the charters and whatnot, but even just from a pure base population standpoint, there's a cost. But I want to talk about schools for a second because that's the biggest thing that comes up when I talk about population decline after jobs. Is like, oh, it's because the schools in South Bend are bad, and the schools in Granger are good. So people, when they have kids, they move out to Granger. And there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not saying that that's like not right, but if you look at Clay Township, right? Clay Township is entirely in the South Bend School District. If you live in Clay Township, you don't live in the city, but your kids still go to South Bend schools. That was true as of 1963. They merged with the school corp. And in like 1970, I believe, we started busing, right? So since 1970, and especially since 1960, if you moved to Clay Township, you were still in the South Bend School Corporation community. But look what happened to Clay Township's growth from 1960 to 2000. Huge growth, from 15,000 to 40,000 people. If it was just schools, if it was just, oh, people left South Bend because the schools were bad, that's it. They wouldn't have moved to Clay Township. They wouldn't have moved to German Township. They wouldn't have moved to Center Township. All those townships have grown since 1960, and they're all in South Bend schools. There has to be something more than just schools, because why would you be moving here if the schools were so bad? And maybe people who move here, they can send their kids to Marion, they can send their kids to St. Joe. That's possible, but I doubt all of them are. There's 40,000 people in Clay Township now. And again, this is what was happening in the city. Same school corp, though, the 2 entities, Clay Township, South Bend, same school corporation. So that's why I think schools are a cost, not a cause of decline. I think our schools are bad because we lost a lot of people. And bad. We have challenges because I have to be careful. Our schools have issues because we lost a lot of people. They're not bad. We didn't lose a lot of people because they're bad. Now, it might have become a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point, right? Everything feeds upon itself. And you've gotten to a point now where, yeah, I know a lot of my friends who live in South Bend, and then they have 2 kids, and those kids turn 5, and they say, I'm going to Granger, and I'm going to come back when my kids are 19. You know, and I have a friend who works at Barn Thornburg. His kids are in high school. He's already looking at houses in South Bend because he wants to be close to the river. He wants to be close to running trails. But he's like, I got to stay in Granger until my kids graduate. I'm not saying it's not part of it, but I think that issue arises from decline, not the other way around. There's also other large-scale costs to this, right? So this is a zip code map. This is 46601. This is 46615. Downtown is right here. This is Granger. This is the emissions each household puts out in CO2 every year. Suburban growth is like a sprawl, right? And it's not even just wealth, because 46617 is this one. Has about the same now median income yearly as Granger. It's like 80,000 now. But because the houses are close together, and because a lot of those people work at Notre Dame, so they walk or they drive only a mile, their emissions per household are a lot smaller than our suburban areas. This is 46614. So that's another cost, right? The city and the county didn't handle this well, and now we spew a lot more emissions. Now we all drive a lot more on roads that, let's be honest guys, the roads aren't so good either. And then a final cost is poverty is concentrated. We know from a ton of studies, concentrated poverty is what's bad for kids. If you're a child and you're born in poverty, your chances of a good life are not great, but they're actually okay. It's not the fact that your parents were poor. Some of you guys might have had really poor parents. That's not the reason a lot of kids end up in jail. That's not why kids end up dropping out of high school. what study after study has shown is when you have concentrated poverty, when you put all the people who are having issues, all the people who are impoverished, you put them in 2 or 3 neighborhoods, you concentrate, you don't give those kids any idea of what life outside of their little tiny declining neighborhood, where you're a kid, you're 10, your parents have no money and their neighborhood's being torn down. That's bad. It's not just like their parents' parents out there are surrounded by other impoverished people. Study after study shows concentrated poverty has terrible outcomes for children, which we should all admit we want to do what's best for those kids, right? Even as South Bend has declined as a population. So in 1980, South Bend had 110,000 people. Again, it's dropped another 9,000 since 1980. Our impoverished residents have grown, have nearly doubled. Even as the overall population is climbing. Poor people in St. Joe County only go to South Bend now. For one, South Bend has a lot of the services, and 2, South Bend is the only place they can afford the rent. St. Joe County's population has grown, again, in that standpoint, and its impoverished residents have grown. But all the growth has been in South Bend. So in 1980, South Bend made up 45% of the overall county, and 61% of its impoverished residents. So not exactly equal, but, pretty close-ish. By 2010, South Bend's overall population count had dropped to 38%, but its share of the impoverished residents rose to 65%. So even as the city is emptying out, more poor people than ever before live in South Bend. And South Bend is now shouldering a larger burden for the whole county, right? Which is not good for anybody. It leads to higher crime, leads to worse outcomes for kids. But this city still supports the county. I already showed you the graph that said over half the jobs in the county are in South Bend. You gotta drive on South Bend roads to get those jobs. You gotta have police protection and fire protection for that job to exist. But even beyond that, this city financially supports all of these things. Forward Field, Morris Performing Arts Center, the whole entire Parks and Trails, the East Race, Howard Park, the Century Center, Potawatomi Museum, South Bend International Airport. The city financially contributes to all of these. But when I say the city, I mean the 102,000 people who live here. But the whole county and metro region benefits from these things existing. How many people do you think that live outside the city come to a Morris show, right? How many people fly out to international airport that South Bend financially contributes to? And I'm not saying these things are bad. I love that they're in South Bend. But there has to be a little bit of thought on the equity of that, right? You have a city that's poorer and poorer and poorer each decade, still supposed to be supporting all these things. And these are just the direct financial contributions. These are all things South Bend indirectly subsidizes for the overall county. IUSB. IUSB is ringed by city roads that the city pays. They don't pay any property taxes. Same with Memorial Hospital, South Bend Clinic, Ivy Tech, St. Joe County courthouses. We need courthouses, right? Those are good. But they're, again, ringed by roads, and they're protected by police and fire, and they don't pay any taxes. South Bend Farmers Market, St. Joe County Public Library, Center for the Homeless, another one where the city ends up having that cost. All these things, and there's 100 more, again, and the jobs. A shrunken city that has less and less people every decade, that has more poor people every decade, still subsidizes all these things because they're all nonprofits. And it's not that no one saw this coming, right? Again, Lloyd Allen, who's become my favorite mayor in the city, the last Republican mayor. This is what he said in 1972. Those who need government services most, the poor, the elderly, those lacking job skills, will continue living in our city. Those who can afford to take care of themselves, provide the services, the tax base to support the services will continue moving out. That must stop. It's the big problem we face in the next decade. The only thing Mr. Allen got wrong was he should have said the next century. We saw this coming, so no one did anything to stop it. And this isn't history, it's now, right? So new single family housing starts in 2020. Granted, this was a pandemic year, so it was a little weird. South Bend was 45. The county and suburbs, this does not include Mishawaka, it was 172. So we're still building, and you guys are building. That's fine. I'm not saying don't build, but you have to realize what's going on. Now, this is a little more closer to what's actually happening. So this is the first half of 2020. South Bend's doing a lot better than 2020, but the county's doing a lot better too, right? Like housing is huge demand. You guys all know this. And it's not history, it's now. In order to keep population stable with the suburbs, South Bend should build approximately 46% of new housing units, not counting Mishawaka because I can't get Mishawaka data because they hide it from me. In the past 3.5 years, South Bend's built 29%. single-family homes. Now, this crucially doesn't include multifamily. That number, because of the way our building department works, the housing unit count's really hard to get. And obviously, South Bend's been building a lot of multifamily, but I still don't think it makes up for the 17% gap. So, we do think there might be a slight shift in the wind, right? This is the estimate for 2020. We should get the final number in August. We've maybe seen stabilization. At the very least, I don't think we're going to see another huge decline. So maybe we're back where we were in the 90s. We're like, okay, we're not collapsing. Maybe we can start thinking about what to do. So what next? What do we have to do to address this? Well, that's a lot below my pay grade. I went to school and got a history degree and a political science degree. I studied fast. But decisions have to be made with population consequences in mind. I think a lot of times people don't want to think about those. And I'm talking our elected leaders, right? They don't want to think about where are people moving, where are people doing. Well, we have to, because again, what I showed you before about the city declining, the county growing, but the city still provides a majority of jobs, the city still provides a lot of services. That's not sustainable, right? Like, at what point does South Bend have to be, is it 50,000 people? Is it 10,000 people? At what point will that break, right? Where we can't pay for the Morse anymore, we can't pay for the airport anymore, we can't pay for these things anymore, we can't pay for the roads to get them anymore, and it's just collapse. What's that going to do for St. Joe County as a whole, right? Like, it's in everyone's best interest for this not to happen. So one of the solutions is filling the ABT. So this is a neighborhood 2 blocks north and west of Riley. So this was 2019. Again, pretty dim. I mean, we talk about these neighborhoods, and great people live here. There's a lot of hardworking people who they don't want to live here. It's the only place they can afford, right? And they're usually good people. And this is what they live in. Like, how does that, as a societal level, like, what does that tell you about the value of that person? Well, this is today. So this is a program through 466 Works. We're able to build 5 homes through partnership with the city and federal government. These homes were built, gosh, it's kind of ridiculous now, but they were about, the first 2 or 3 were about 150, 160 grand. They sold for like 100. Now, the most recent one, I just permitted one built here, it cost 200 grand to build, and it's going to sell for maybe 130. So, obviously the neighborhood isn't there, but at least we're trying to do something. This is, I'm sure all you guys know, this is the old transpo site. That was 2018, this is it today. What's interesting to me about the transpo site, and this is a city problem. Again, this isn't really a you guys problem. This is 2.5 miles from Notre Dame. I live a couple blocks from here. These neighborhoods are occupied by full-time residents, most, from what I can tell, especially the single family. Like, there's kids who live here, they have jungle gyms in their backyard, they've got bikes, they're out walking all the time. It's not like these are, a lot of the growth we've seen near Notre Dame are basically empty housing units that get rented out for football games, right? Or they come for football games. That's not what we've seen here. And all it took, well, it took a lot, but it took us finding a big piece of land, the city put in the infrastructure, and Transpo sold it. And yeah, we put a great park right next to it, right? So that's how the city can do things, right? Make the city good to exist in. And the market responds. These are going for 5, 6, 700,000. There is value in city living. It's not for everybody. In the United States, we have a very individual mindset, which is great. We have a very entrepreneurial mindset, which is great. A lot of people want their half acre. I grew up in a suburb like that. There's great benefits to it. But not everybody wants to live on a half acre on a cul-de-sac. Even if it's just 25% of people might want to live in something like this. There is something there that I think the city can do to help turn this around. You can learn more. There's a lot of great books on this stuff. The city put out a vacant abandoned task force in 2013, which is really great. Resource if you want to know about how all the vacant houses came about. And something we talk about a lot is promoting incremental development, right? So trying to get somebody to build in these neighborhoods somehow, right? And this doesn't scale all this well, but there is ways to start doing it. The city also, the last thing I'll say, is the city used to kind of give away what made the city great. We used to have developers come, they were on the edge of town, and they say, we want to extend water and sewer. Well, that was good. We saw growth, especially if in this part of the city that's in the school board, but the city would just kind of give it away. And yeah, like not give it away, but I have a friend who lives in Clay Township, and he just pays 20% more surcharge for his water. That's like $1. The city just incentivizes growth on its edge. So that was one thing the city recently did, the Board of Public Works, of which I'm a member. We voted on a rule where we made a map where all the areas within the map that we've already agreed that this area can have city sewer and water, those are fine. All previous existing agreements have not changed. But what we've said is we're not going to keep extending water and sewer out on the edges. So that's one step the city's done to say, hey, we have to look out for ourselves too, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do, but I don't really have a grand ending because again, it's not the best like story of uplifting growth. Like I wish I could end it with like, hey, we saw 10,000 people move into the city and things are turning around. But I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you guys have a lot of history in this too, especially some aspects I don't understand. But thanks for having me.